Taken from Tatiana Nematovskaya's diary. It was early spring 1933. I was walking with my colleague and I had a camera with me. There was an exhausted Kazakh man sitting on the edge of the road. He had just returned from working in the field. He was so exhausted that he could barely walk. He was groaning and asking for food and something to drink. I gave my camera to my companion and I rushed to bring him some water. He was drinking greedily. I hadn't noticed when my companion took a picture, and again I rushed home to get a slice of bread and some sugar for the starving man. Once I got back with the bread, he was already dead.
Stalin had never been to Kazakhstan. He didn't know anything about the Kazakh lifestyle. And even Golshikin, who was the local leader, had never been to a Kazakh village. That's why no one could predict the Kazakhs would die. Stalin and all his governors thought that Kazakhs were a backwards people. He didn't even consider them to be human beings. His main goal was to keep Russians in control and in senior positions. And he wanted to Russianize all the Kazakhs into similar ethnic groups. Before 1991, when Kazakhstan became an independent republic, the policy of Moscow was to make all the Kazakhs forget their national language and to Russianize the population.
As the Bolsheviks had come to power through revolution, they believed that revolution was the most effective way to force progress, and thus, what happened in Kazakhstan was simply a continuation of Red October.
На Северном Кавказе. Все там было.
Golshikin, although the leader of Kazakhstan, was still powerless from going against orders from Moscow. His colleagues of equivalent rank were leading the other republics of the Soviet Union who executed Stalin's policies. Who is to be blamed? Stalin and his regime.
Изначально идея Малого Октября, она пришла из Казахстана в Москву.
The idea of a small October revolution originated in Kazakhstan and then went to Moscow. Golshikin, who was the head of the Kazakh Soviet Republic, thought that a revolution was necessary. The Soviets wanted to force collectivization, and they started to work to make that happen. Even the local officials, who were Kazakhs, Russians, Latvians, and Jews, got orders from Moscow. They said that it wouldn't work. However, their recommendations either didn't get to Moscow or they were ignored.
All the things that were done here were done in a revolutionary way.
But as far as I see, the works of the Kazakhstani historians, they provided a lot of documents where the local authorities, where the central authorities acted extremely brutal. They used force, death penalties, a lot of dangerous and tragic things in order to implement their plans, in order to fulfill their plans. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there is no any evidence that within the high party authorities, there existed some kind of the plan in order to destroy at least 30–40% of the Kazakh population. What for?
Right.
My grandfather was a rich Kazakh man who engaged in horse breeding. He was imprisoned because he was one of Kazakhstan's wealthiest men, and he died in 1930 in Auliye Ata prison. I'm his grandson.
Was Kazakh society more critical or critical at all to the Soviet government? Less, much less in comparison with the other national republics. Don't forget, again, we talked before that this region, which we called Middle Asia, they were not part of the Russian Empire, they were protectorates, and they were not subordinated to Russian power so much as Kazakhs were used to.
The local Kazakh authorities were afraid to inform Stalin about the situation. They wanted Golshikin to go away, and they thought that if the situation got worse, that he would be sent away.
ауыр болса,
It wasn't until the summer of 1932 that the Kazakh authorities sent the first letter to Stalin informing him about the famine. The communist totalitarian regime was guilty for causing the famine.
If Stalin admitted that there was a famine in USSR, he would have disavowed his concept and views admitting defeat. He would have admitted that he was wrong and that Bukharin and the other members of the right-wing opposition were right.
It's explained by geopolitical situation. Soviet government didn't want to show its weakness in the face of the enemy.
Right.
Yeah, as the West was usually seen by the Soviet government.
Этого можно было избежать. Я читал различного рода донесения.
It could have been avoided. I've read various reports on the famine, including reports from some of the survivors. In my opinion, as Alibi Jangildin has written, there needs to be some sort of education to provide help for Kazakhs on overcoming this event. The Soviet leadership was not interested and did not care about what was happening. I think with a sensible approach, the famine would have been avoidable. The Soviets just had other goals. But those who knew how to plant survived, and those that couldn't adapt died. For example, they could have harvested potatoes if they knew how.
To put down the various rebellions, Soviet headquarters sent the 8th Cavalry Division, and some were even bombed by aircraft.
The differences are the Ukrainians were farmers and Kazakhs weren't. For example, in the west regions of Kazakhstan, people were dying because they didn't know that they could eat fish. For example, there were plenty of fish in Ural River. In Almaty, witnesses reported that many people died because they didn't know how they could eat anything except meat, and all their cattle was taken away for the Soviet army.
When counting the total number of deaths, more ethnic Russians died, but percentage-wise, it was much higher for the Kazakh population.
I wrote my article on the Kazakh famine and called a demographer named Tatimov. Right away he said it was 2 million people who died. I said, I think it's too much. So he said, let it be 1,750,000. And that's why the official number is 1,750,000.
In nomadic herding, for example, the herd can consist of 600 heads of sheep. So while one sheep is eating the grass, the next one is fanning out further to eat. And the next one is fanning out even further than the previous one, and so on. When you have 2,000 heads of sheep instead of 600, the sheep in the rear have to cover such a distance as they fan out for new grass that they end up starving to death. That's what was happening with all their cattle. They weren't able to eat, so they died. When nomads lose their cattle, they cannot feed themselves because their bodies are tuned to drink milk and eat meat. And even if they try some sort of grains, mushrooms, or berries, their stomachs cannot digest them. And that's why the nomadic people were dying. Cattle was also their only means of transportation. And losing cattle meant that they lost their ability to travel in search of jobs or food.
Of course, modernization was not worth all of the victims. I think it's an incorrect understanding of the situation. That modernization needs to have a price, costing human lives. In order to modernize, why do you need to kill people? I think these things are not related to each other. The Soviet government have particular goals, and they were achieving them, and they weren't concerned with the conditions of the people and the number of victims. The same thing happened in World War II when people were sent into battle without weapons. They were sending waves of unarmed people to defeat the enemy. They had particular goals to achieve, and how they went about achieving them didn't matter. We had a large population, so that women could have more children. I think there could have been a softer form of modernization and adaptation of the population. But what happened has already happened, and it was because of Soviet ideology. From a historical perspective, it's really hard to judge because a lot of good things happened in Kazakhstan during the Soviet government. Now we are seeing that we've been an independent country for the last 25 years. But for the last 25 years, we haven't produced any great artists, poets, or singers. Mukhagali Makatayev, Alibek Denishev, Fariza, our great people were born out of Soviet system of education and culture. And these poets were still honoring and representing Kazakh tradition and culture, such as Tlendiev, who was a product of the Soviet Union, and Baurjan Momushula. But now we don't have such people, and it's a big question as to why.
Why society is quite, not probably indifferent, but less active concerning the discussions of the famine of the 1930s. Yes, because it's partly it's past, and we should be very careful concerning the certain things and accusations in order to avoid the clashes between people.
Возможно,
We're writing about it a lot, but nowadays young people read very little. In general, students are either surfing the internet or on their iPhones. And students know very little, and in the future they will know even less. Our generation will remember, but for the next generation this knowledge is fading away.
Today, young people find out about the famine only in school. For them, it sounds like a fairy tale or even a legend.